September 77, Port Elizabeth, weather fine. It was business as usual in Police Room 619. Does that sound familiar? The verse comes from a song by Peter Gabriel from 1980 and is not a normal feel-good pop song as you would expect from the ex-Genesis frontman. In fact, it is about structural injustice, racial hatred, and the killing of black people. Somewhat more easily digestible, packaged in a melodic song. Specifically, it is about the cruel murder of Steve Biko 3 years earlier by security police officers in 1977. This business as usual in Police Room 619 that Peter Gabriel sings about means the cruel everydayness with which nonconformists and black activists were tortured to death in the South African regime of the time, including Biko. Of course, no one wanted to admit this. It was always accidents and clumsiness that led to the deaths of the black political prisoners, slipping on the soap in the shower, tripping on the stairs, falling over a chair, falling out of the window, choking while eating, hanging themselves, or strangled by their own hand. For too long, the world had closed its eyes to the injustices of the apartheid regime in South Africa. For too long, there had been cover-ups and lies about what so many souls suffered. Steve Biko's death was of tragic and crucial significance. His sacrifice was to mark the slow end of apartheid in South Africa. It took enough death, including Biko, and a song to draw the world's attention to the injustice. And after the 1987 film Cry Freedom, no one could deny the shame. In fact, Biko wanted more than the end of the apartheid system. He wanted to break the chains inside people. He wanted the black people who had been enslaved for centuries to free themselves from the inferiority complex and to become aware again of what the whites had tried to take away from them. Their dignity, their pride, their power, and their history. Biko knew what he was talking about. After his birth in 1946, Batu Stephen Biko was raised in a township where he lived among Africans and colored people, separated from the white privileged minority in the country. The country had long been characterized by inequality between black and white, and the apartheid system became official in 1948. The result was racial laws designed to establish racial segregation ideologically, socially, politically, economically, and geographically. The mixing of the races was to be prevented at all costs. So marriage or any kind of sexual relationship between whites and all other races was forbidden. There were forced resettlements, and non-whites or blacks were denied education as well as the right to vote, so that the white privileged class had a broad mass of underprivileged, low-wage workers at its disposal. In fact, with the ANC, the African National Congress, and the PAC, the rather radical Pan-Africanist Congress, there were movements demanding change and an end to discrimination. There was even a public demonstration in March 1960, where the demonstrators reacted to the new passport laws and the accompanying restrictions on blacks by white. But this demonstration went down in history as the Sharpeville massacre, with the police shooting 69 of the peaceful demonstrators, causing such unrest in the country that the government decided to arrest 20,000 demonstrators and declared the ANC and the PAC illegal. A period of political paralysis followed. Enter Steve Biko. Although an overachiever at school, he began to clash early on as he began to question the authorities and the system after being expelled from school for his brother's allegedly illicit political activities. He became passionate about anti-colonial ideas and their heroes, reading the Pan-Africanists Garvey and Bois, and was strongly influenced by the ideas of Frantz Fanon, according to whom the oppression after centuries of brainwashing of black people must be fought deep in the psyche of the people. He saw, even if the whites tried to cover it up, there has always been black resistance to white dominance, but there were different strands. So on the one hand, there was the ANC and Martin Luther King, who sought a peaceful dialogue of all races, and on the other hand, there was the Black Power movement, who questioned the whole exploitive capitalist system and saw here the approach for change. Biko began to get active. He was lucky enough to get a scholarship and started studying medicine at the University of Natal in 1966, where he became directly part of the student movement. But this was full of white people. They were pretty liberal on the race issue, but this liberalism was limited to theoretical statements and symbolic actionism. The essence of the matter is that NUSAS was founded on white initiative, is financed by white money, and reflects the opinions of the majority of its members who are white, summarized a white NUSAS leader. This hypocrisy was too much for Biko in the long run.
First of all, we said as black students, we could not participate in multiracial organizations, which were by far white organizations, because in this country, there is an overwhelming number of white students at university. And secondly, these organizations were concentrating mainly on problems which were affecting the white student community, which meant that NUSAS as an organization gave political opinions which were largely affected by the whiteness of that particular organization.
The privileged would never stand up for change because they are not affected by the disadvantages. Biko was convinced Black people have to make their own decision, and so he founded his own student movement, SASO, South African Students' Organization, in 1969. The special part, only Black people were allowed to be members. Biko justified this simply by saying that Blacks and whites lived in two different classes, with whites having the privilege of choosing whether or not to give up their privileges. In fact, it makes a big difference whether I stand up against racism as a white German or as a Black person. First of all, you have to understand the privileges that exist and the struggle against them. Because of these different realities and the resulting interests, there simply cannot be a real partnership between the classes. That's why SASO, like Black Power, initially only welcomed Black people. Being Black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being Black is a reflection of a mental attitude. With the members of SASO, Biko developed the ideology Black consciousness, a new philosophy of liberation. Biko starts here in the psyche of the oppressed. Power and powerlessness always have a psychological side. The greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, because the strongest chains that bind us lie in our own psyche. The manipulation of Black people by the white upper class went so far that Black people developed a chronic inferiority complex. It is incredibly difficult to change the self-image of a person who is constantly suggested that he or she is basically inferior on all levels.
Changes which are to come can only come as a result of a program worked out by Black people. And for Black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them. And this was the psychological feeling of inferiority.
For centuries, the oppressed were denied their humanity so that they could be exploited more easily. Like a crippling poison, white arrogance crept into the brains and hearts of Black people. White South Africans usually defined Black people as lazy, stupid, and dishonest. But their biggest fault was that they were not white. White was the norm, Black an anomaly. All with power were white. Even Jesus Christ is portrayed as white, while the devil is portrayed as Black. The best thing, according to this logic, was to at least try to become as white as possible on the inside. As a result, Black people lost their awareness of their own power and strength. So often, so much is spoken to us, about us, and for us, he said, but very rarely do we speak ourselves. And Steve Biko wanted to correct this sense of powerlessness and alienation, so he set out to make the exploited aware of this brainwashing. But changing one's consciousness is one of the most difficult tasks a person can face. The goal was a new Black self-understanding and a political consciousness about one's own oppression based on racist discrimination. Black consciousness reminded Black people that their strength lay in solidarity and unity. Therefore, Biko and his supporters set out to build community structures under the motto Blacks Helping Black. These Black community programs were aimed at the education and health system of the Black population. For Biko, community development was part of the process of infusing Black people with a sense of pride and dignity. After the ANC and PAC became illegal and their leaders, including Nelson Mandela, were imprisoned, the Black consciousness movement filled the void. Biko tried to create a dialogue between the different parties, knowing that there is strength in unity. Under the pseudonym Frank Talk, he wrote about the ideas of Black consciousness, his philosophy of peaceful coexistence among the people of South Africa in a column called I Write What I Like. Biko's goal was not to replace white dominance with Black dominance. His dream was that all races could meet as equal. But South Africa was not ready for this dream. Biko was increasingly targeted by the South African security authorities and the apartheid government. They finally banned him in March '73. Because Black consciousness was a clear threat to the white minority government, because not only did they question the structural racist injustices, but also tried to restore self-confidence of the oppressed. So as a prelude, whites must be made to realize that they are only human, not superior. Same with Blacks, they must be made to realize that they are also human, not inferior. Jimmy Kruger, the then Minister of Police and Justice, personally signed the order. Biko was now under surveillance, forbidden to leave his hometown of King Williamstown and not allowed to speak to more than one person at a time. But Biko did not allow himself to be silent. He continued to be involved in developing social structures in his community and bringing people together. His hope slowly became reality, the oppressed demanded more and more of their rights. In 1976, there were large student demonstrations because Afrikaans was to become the mandatory language of education in secondary schools. In the same year, the police shot into the crowd in the Johannesburg township Soweto. South Africa was in flames. The police again reacted with great brutality and an unprecedented wave of arrests. With all its might, the government tried to suppress the desire for change. Biko was arrested on the 18th August 1977 on his way back home from a political meeting in Port Elizabeth. He was not accused of any specific crime, rather the anti-terror laws in force made the arrest possible. After arriving at the police station in Port Elizabeth, he was kept naked and chained in the cell for 18 days. On the 6th September, he was taken to the notorious police room 619, where Biko was interrogated for over 22 hours. What exactly happened is still unclear. What is clear, however, is that Biko was to die 6 days later. At first, they tried to cover up the whole thing and blamed the death on Biko's hunger strike. But after the autopsy showed that Biko had been badly beaten, had several broken ribs, severe brain injuries, and a smashed kidney, it was claimed that he had caused the injuries himself. After the interrogation, Biko was left chained and naked in the cell for 2 days before he was taken to the army hospital in Pretoria, over 1,100 kilometers away. Shortly after his arrival, Biko was to die alone in his cell on the evening of the 12th September from his severe and untreated injuries. The then Justice Minister Kruger, of course, denied any misconduct of the part of the police officers and commented on the death of the 30-year-old Biko and father of 5 children with "Dit laat me koud, dit leaves me cold." It was only 20 years later that the perpetrators were to make a partial confession, but none of them ever had to be punished. Harold Nyman later died of cancer, as did Gideon Newwood, who was notorious for his cruel torture methods and was responsible for the death of many anti-apartheid activists. Steve Biko's funeral became a political demonstration. His coffin was accompanied by tens of thousands, including representatives of Western governments. Observers placed his death in the ranks of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. His name spread around the world, and with his death, the disgust against the system in which a white minority ruled over the black majority, depriving them of their rights, marginalizing them, and using them only as cheap labor. The new black self-confidence that Biko dreamed of was in the world, and this world, thanks to Biko and the other anti-apartheid fighters, finally looked to South Africa. The song Biko by Peter Gabriel became an anti-apartheid anthem, although it was banned by the government in South Africa. It was to take until 1994 for the apartheid regime to finally come to an end. It was an incredibly long and difficult struggle, and Steve Biko was one of the most important fighters. It is better to die for an idea that will live than to live for an idea that will die. His fate shows once again that the white people take for granted what black people had to fight for again and again with a lot of courage and suffering. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in more exciting personalities from history, please click here.